Good morning, Winepress. I'm Angie, and I'm really excited to be sharing with you today on Joseph and Zechariah. We have two Bible readings today, so I'm going to read the first one from Matthew 1, verse 18. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. Our second reading for today comes from Luke chapter 1, verse 5 to 25. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once, when Zechariah's division was on duty, and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of the incense came, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Zechariah asked the angel, How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years. The angel said to him, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until this day happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. Each year when it gets to Christmas and I start reading through the Christmas stories in Matthew and Luke, the two people who really stand out to me are Zechariah and Joseph. And they're not usually the two that we are most interested in. We love hearing about Jesus himself, who it's all about. We love hearing about the courage of Mary, or the glamour of the wise men, or the angels, or even just the inclusiveness of the shepherds. And of course, all the kids love hearing about all of the animals. So technically, both Joseph and Zechariah achieved very little in their lives, certainly by the standards of their culture. And yet, who they were as people, rather than what they achieved, created a context in which the world was changed forever. Matthew and Luke tell us explicitly that both Joseph and Zechariah were righteous and upright men. And very few people at all are called this in the Bible. So when you hear that, it should really prick your ears. It should make you ask, what is it about these people that makes them considered righteous? Well, the way in which we see Joseph and Zechariah's righteousness play out isn't in their workplace or their political, social, or religious spheres, although I'm sure it did. Instead, we see it simply in their relationships with their immediate families. So let's take a closer look at Zechariah first. Zechariah was, and had been for many years, married to a woman who was unable to have children. It's a detail we can pass over today, but he lived at a time when a woman's whole role and identity was defined by her ability to continue a family line. In the book of Leviticus, being childless was listed as a possible punishment for sin. So when we encounter Elizabeth and Zechariah, we must understand the shame and the suspicion that would have surrounded them. What could they have possibly have done to deserve that fate? How had they displeased God? Those kind of questions would have been bounced around their community. Zechariah would have been well within the bounds of cultural propriety to divorce Elizabeth and marry someone else. Most likely he had endured pressure from others to do just that, or he'd had to listen to the gossip about himself and his wife. And yet he chose to stay. He chose not to take another wife. He chose to be faithful. And the way Luke describes their marriage is this beautiful partnership. We're given Elizabeth's ancestry, which is very uncommon, and she's described right alongside Zechariah as being blameless and devout. In fact, the only woman in the Bible to be described that way. We know that Elizabeth felt her pain of childlessness deeply, because her response to becoming pregnant was to say that God has taken away my disgrace. But in the midst of their pain was this beautiful marriage of unity in worship. Zechariah found himself in a painful situation, but chose to stay. Joseph, on the other hand, had to make a choice to actively step into a painful situation with Mary and actually accept a share in her shame. When we look back through the Old Testament, we know that it was Israel's cycle of sin that ultimately led to their exile into foreign lands. And now that they've finally been able to return, they're still under this oppressive Roman rule. And so there's this belief running around that if people would just return to the law wholeheartedly, if they could just devote themselves to God and just do it right, then Israel would be restored to its former glory. So if Joseph wants to be considered righteous by his community, he could have taken Mary to trial and ultimately sent her to death, but at the very least, he should have had nothing to do with her, a woman who'd fallen pregnant outside of marriage. But being a righteous man meant also being open to God's leading to do something even greater than what his culture was telling him to do. And that was to marry Mary and raise Jesus. So I love reading about Zechariah and Joseph because they made these impossible choices to remain and to invest faithfully in families that they had every right and the social expectation to walk away from. Neither of them achieved anything much by the world's standards. They didn't found a nation like Abraham, conquer kingdoms like Joshua. They weren't especially wise or rich like Solomon. We remember them only as two people who changed the world simply by choosing to love their families, even when it was hard. And in doing that, they created a space that was ready to receive the King of heaven and earth. So as we head into Christmas and all the busyness that it brings, I wonder if you could take some time to consider, how does your righteousness play out in your family, both in your home and in your spiritual family here at church? Are you cultivating spaces that are ready to receive the gift of Jesus this Christmas?